Wolverine, Storm, Nightcrawler, Colossus, and Banshee joined together with original X-Men leader Cyclops to form what would go on to be the most iconic X-Men team of all time. This week on Comic History. What's up guys, Roman from R&S Entertainment here, and welcome to Comic History, the weekly video series where I retell, explain, and give context to the iconic storylines, origins, and events in the world of comics. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the book that redefined the X-Men from a group of teenage superheroes to the diverse adult mutant team that we all know them as today. Giant Size X-Men #1 by Wein and Dave Cockrum. Initially, the Stan Lee Jack Kirby created X-Men in the 1960s were a teenage superhero team operating under Professor Xavier to stop evil mutants from damaging relations between humans and themselves, and consisted of Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, Jean Grey, aka Marvel Girl, Hank McCoy, aka Beast, Bobby Drake, aka Iceman, and Warren Worthington III, aka Angel. I've covered the origin of the Lee Kirby X-Men team in my Origin of the X-Men video, so make sure to check that video out as well. Though the first X-Men book was initially somewhat successful, by the late 60s and early 70s, the sales had fallen behind Marvel's other properties, causing the book to be essentially cancelled, spending the first few years of the 1970s reprinting their older stories. In 1975, the X-Men underwent a revival and resurgence with Wein and David Cockrum's giant-sized X-Men #1, which changed the roster almost entirely with all of the original team members other than Cyclops, and a little later Jean Grey, leaving the X-Men to be replaced with an international team of mutants from across the globe. Following this issue, the most important and quintessential X-Men writer of all time, Claremont, began writing the main X-Men title from 1975 to 1991, being the architect and creator of the best X-Men stories and characters of all time. Jean Grey's ascent as the Phoenix, the introduction of the Hellfire Club, Emma Frost, and Kitty Pryde, among others, hallmark stories like Days of Future Past, The Mutant Massacre, and the Dark Phoenix Saga, along with so many other moments, characters, and storylines without which we would not have the X-Men as we know them today. Claremont's X-Men run skyrocketed the X-Men to the highest selling title of its time, and the defining metric by which comic book quality was measured, and it all started here, so let's jump right in. Our story begins in a small village deep in the Bavarian Alps, where a young mutant with a devilish appearance flees an angry mob carrying torches and pitchforks and calling him a monster. He thinks to himself that they are the monsters and that he had only escaped his previous life as a circus freak to learn from quote-unquote normal humans. For Nightcrawler's full origin, check out my Origin of Nightcrawler episode of Comic History. Kurt decides that if violence was the only lesson humanity had to teach him, he would learn it well, lunging into the crowd and eventually being overcome by the mob. As they prepare to drive a stake through his heart, Kurt hears a disembodied voice command them to stop. The entire mob freezes in place, and Kurt is approached by Professor Charles Xavier, who tells him that there is a place where he could learn among his own kind, a school for mutants to hone their abilities. Kurt agrees to go with him, stating that all he wants is to learn how to be a complete person. Xavier continues his recruitment of mutants, traveling to Quebec, Canada to approach Wolverine, aka Weapon X, with a similar offer. Wolverine had just made his first appearance in comics in The Incredible Hulk 181, along with being in one panel of Incredible Hulk 180, and was co-created by the writer of Giant Size X-Men, Wein, only a few short months earlier. Xavier tells Wolverine that he was aware of his battle with the Hulk, and of his powers, which the Professor informs him are mutant in origin. Xavier offers Wolverine the chance to operate as a free agent without the red tape of the Canadian government constantly holding him back. Wolverine's handler tells him that the government has invested too much time and money creating him for him to leave, but he extends a claw with a snikt and puts it up to the man's face, saying he resigns. After making a brief stop in Tennessee to recruit Irish mutant Banshee from the original X-Men title to his new team, Xavier travels to Kenya in East Africa, where Aurora, goddess of the storm, rules over simple tribal villagers, raising her hands and then flying into the sky, bringing first lightning and then rainstorms to water the villagers' crops. Aurora then hears the voice of Charles Xavier in her mind, saying that her powers were beautiful, but that she is no goddess. Xavier says that she has a land and worshippers, but that Xavier wanted to offer her a world, the real world, not a fantasy like this life she's created pretending to be a goddess. Sensing the sincerity and charisma in Xavier's words, Aurora agrees to go with him and see what the real world has to offer. In Siberia, Russia, farm worker Pyotr Rasputin sees a runaway tractor barreling toward his little sister Ilyana, running into its path while metal grows over his skin, scooping his sister into his arms and taking the brunt of the impact as the machine crashes directly into him, destroying it entirely but leaving Colossus and his sister unharmed. For the full extended version of Colossus's origin, go check out my Origin of Colossus episode. Xavier approaches Colossus, telling him that his powers were needed and that he could help the world while learning of his mutant abilities. Later, in the Camp Verde Reservation in Arizona, the Apache John Proudstar chases after a bison at full speed, showing his mutant ability of great strength and durability by wrestling the bison to the ground by its horns, taking out his anger and frustration at his people being reduced from the warriors they once were. When Xavier makes his offer, John angrily refuses and tells Xavier that he would never help a white man, and when he turns his back, Xavier challenges him, asking if all of his people were such frightened, selfish children. Desperate to prove himself good enough, Proudstar agrees to follow Xavier, who wonders to himself whether these new X-Men would be enough to save the world, or if they would only lead it to ruin. Finally, Xavier's new X-Men are assembled at his Westchester estate and mutant training facility, outfitting those who didn't already have costumes, unlike Wolverine, Banshee, and Sunfire, a Japanese mutant and old friend of Xavier who he also made a brief stop to recruit, who all already had superhero identities and costumes of their own, with outfits made of unstable molecules courtesy of Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four. Professor X then introduces the new X-Men to the leader of the original X-Men, Scott Summers aka Cyclops, who begins to inform them that the reason Xavier gathered them together was that in a previous mission, all of the original X-Men other than Cyclops had disappeared. Taking the new X-Men to Cerebro, a machine used by Xavier and Cyclops to detect, identify, and track new mutants with emerging powers, Cyclops recounts the events leading up to the X-Men's disappearance. When the team, which at that point consisted of original members Cyclops, Marvel Girl, Iceman, and Angel, along with Scott's brother Alex Summers aka Havoc, and his girlfriend Lorna Dane aka Polaris, who would later be revealed to be the daughter of Magneto, were alerted by the strongest mutant reading Cerebro had ever shown, leading them to immediately rush out to the island of Krakoa to find this insanely powerful mutant before someone with less good intentions could do the same. On the way, Jean notes to Scott that they could have used their other original teammate, Beast, but Scott reminds her that Hank McCoy had graduated from the X-Men and found himself a place on the Avengers instead. Landing their specialized jet on Krakoa, Cyclops and the other X-Men are barely on the ground before they're attacked by an unknown force that blasts Cyclops into unconsciousness before he even saw what hit them. Cyclops awakens sometime later on the X-Jet, his costume in tatters and his head in searing pain. Panicking when he realizes his eyes are uncovered, Scott realizes in horror that his powers are being held back and that he can't project his optic blasts. The X-Jet's autopilot returns Scott to Xavier's mansion, where his powers start to return to him with a red glow and then a giant, uncontrollable blast of energy. After modifying one of Scott's old visors into a new costume, Xavier proceeded to gather the new X-Men while Cyclops retrained himself in the control of his powers. The X-Men board the X-Jet and make their way to Krakoa, with the ride highlighting their characters and the differences in the team dynamics from the original X-Men, where the original X-Men were young teens who grew up together as friends in the original comics. These new X-Men are strangers assembled for their own reasons, with some of them even having previous combat experience or training. Where the original X-Men generally got along, several members of this new team are openly hostile to the others, with Sunfire originally refusing to help at all before coming later, and Thunderbird obstinate and hesitant to listen to orders. When they arrive at the island, Cyclops forms them into pairs of two and drops them on opposite corners to avoid being taken out all at once like his original team. The island itself begins to try to actively stop them from reaching a mysterious temple at the center, but though the X-Jet disappears and each pair of X-Men are attacked by everything from living vines to giant crabs, they all eventually prove themselves capable and reach the center. Cyclops coordinates his I-beams with Storm's lightning, Sunfire's heat blast, and Colossus's fucking fist, and the X-Men break their way into the stone temple to find the original members unconscious and entangled in living tentacles that appear to be feeding on them. As the new team frees the original members, the temple begins to shake and fall apart, and when they make it outside, the original X-Men wake up, with Angel saying that Cyclops should never have come back for them, that this was all a trap, and that the mutant they thought was on the island was the island itself. Krakoa, the island who walks like a man, forms itself into a giant monstrous creature, telepathically flooding the X-Men's minds with mental images of its origin as a test site for nuclear bombs, with the radiation seeping into all of the island's living organisms and mutating them into a collective colony intelligence with massive powers and a growing hunger. Being unsatisfied with feeding only on the mental energies of the original X-Men, Krakoa had psychically manipulated both Cyclops and Professor Xavier to gather these new mutants and bring them into its trap. An epic fight then breaks out between both teams of X-Men and the Living Island, showcasing all of their powers and raging on until Professor X telepathically contacts Cyclops, telling him that he has discovered Krakoa's weak point, joining the battle in his own way by engaging Krakoa's colony intelligence with his own psychic powers, locking it in a mental battle as Storm flies into the air, summoning a lightning storm to feed energy into Polaris's magnetic powers, overcharging her until she begins to scream in pain. Alex tells Scott to call Storm off, but Cyclops refuses as if left unchecked, Krakoa's immense power could be a threat to not just them, but the entire world. With Polaris literally glowing with power, the rain from Storm's powers begins to give strength back to Krakoa, feeding its plant life and giving it enough power to overcome Xavier and push him into unconsciousness. The other X-Men leap back into battle with Cyclops yelling "now" to Havoc, firing both of their powers at the tower of swirling energy around Lorna, setting off the gigantic power straight down, blasting through Krakoa to reach all the way into the Earth's core, literally severing the Earth's magnetic fields for a brief moment and causing a gravity disruption that shakes the Living Island apart around them. As Krakoa's monster form falls apart, he calls out for help, with the X-Men escaping onto an ice raft Iceman creates on the ocean. The magnetic forces around Krakoa cause it to no longer be tethered to the Earth's gravity, sending it rocketing into space as the X-Men psychically hear its anguished death cries. The void of the island disappearing causes a massive whirlpool, and the X-Men are battered against the inside of an ice dome until finally floating back to the surface. They then find the X-Jet relatively undamaged in the water, and all cram into the small ship, wondering what in the world they're gonna do with 13 X-Men. And that wraps up Giant Size X-Men number 1, one of, if not the most important X-Men issues of all time, and the beginning of the era that created all of the biggest and best X-Men stories. From this point, the original X-Men, minus Scott Summers and then eventually Jean Grey, all retire from the team, opting to go live normal lives while most of the new team members stick around, other than Sunfire, who immediately quits and returns to Japan, and Thunderbird, who becomes the first X-Man to ever die in the following issues. And the rest, as they say, is comic history. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, leave me a comment letting me know who your favorite X-Men character or lineup is, and subscribe to RNS Entertainment for weekly content on comics, movies, and more. If you want to see more cool stories like this, definitely go check out my comic history playlist for all of the episodes, or my X-Men history playlist for just the X-Men stuff. Also, make sure to subscribe to my gaming channel, RNS Gaming, for weekly Let's Plays, live streams, and other great video game content. Follow all of my social media via the links in the description box below. And if you want to help support my channel and get exclusive content and other rewards, consider checking out my Patreon. I want to give a huge thanks to Drew Miles and Jason Cantu for being $10 or higher patrons this month, and I will see you all next time.